And I'm delighted that we are welcoming our, put her on the, put her in front and center so everyone can meet Jenn Carlier. I first met Jenn in September of this year at the TheoEd conference in Atlanta. And if you remember, First Presbyterian co-hosted TheoEd in February. Last week, we had a TheoEd speaker, Liz Clayson Kelly, and this week we're excited to have another TheoEd speaker. So that's where I met Jenn. And she spoke, and I was taking notes, and Jenn, I was not texting, I was taking notes. And one thing that she said that just has stuck with me, she said, vulnerability is an act of hospitality. And it really has been the inspiration for this series that we have now, this 4 weeks on hospitality. So we're so glad to have you with us. Jenn is joining us from Decatur, but she grew up in the Netherlands, which is a fun fact that not many of us can claim. She got a Master of English Language and Literature and a Master of Religious Studies at universities in the Netherlands. And both of those were on C.S. Lewis, which I think is really cool. And then she moved to the United States and got a Master of Divinity from Columbia Theological Seminary. And she now has a PhD from Emory, and her dissertation title was Finding God in the Basement, Addiction and Metaphors for Salvation. Which I would love to hear even more about that. She's currently on the staff at the Candler School of Theology, and she's teaching this semester, another interesting class, Theology, Ethics, and Addictions. Wow. So she's also a member of Kirkwood United Church of Christ, and she is a youth mentor there, which is another thing that I found really interesting. And she advocates for destigmatizing mental health and addiction. So it's part of what we're trying to do here as well. So Jenn, thank you so much for being here. We're excited to have you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. As Jarrell said, I am from the Netherlands, so I'm sorry that we beat you in soccer yesterday. But I'm not that sorry, actually. The plan for today is I want to tell you a little bit of my story, and then I want to have a conversation with you about what some of the things I talk about might look like at First Pres in Charlotte. The story I want to tell you started before I moved from the Netherlands. So about 15 years ago, I ended up going to rehab for addiction, which admittedly was not really on my bucket list of things I wanted to achieve in my life, but there you have it. So I went to this place, and it ended up being a really formative and beautiful experience for me. At the time, I was going to a church that I was a very active member of. And I love this church very much, and I still do. But I didn't tell anyone at the church where I was going. I told them I was going on a lengthy, silent spiritual retreat because I knew I wouldn't have my phone with me, and I knew they would find it strange that they couldn't reach me for 4 weeks. So I told them that because at the church that I was going to, we never really talked about addiction, and no one that I knew was really struggling with addiction. And so the idea of telling anyone at church that I was struggling much less going to rehab was just unthinkable to me. For me, as a missionary kid, I grew up as a missionary kid in Taiwan. And one of the things that I learned early on was church is where you show up on your best behavior. And that has always kind of stuck with me. And I always, one of the things I think about too is, right, that church is one of those places where we all sort of show up looking our best as well, which I think is kind of a subtle but clear hint about the kind of person that we're expected to be at church. When I finished rehab, I went to 12-step groups in the basements of churches. And these groups asked of me something that the churches I had been a part of really hadn't asked of me before. They asked me to show up fully and completely as me. And so I started telling them bits of my story, and these people in these groups gave me the most gracious response possible. Every time I told them something about myself that I felt a lot of shame about, they would offer back this unconditional regard and acceptance. And it seemed like the more I shared of myself, the more they loved me, not in spite of the messiness that I bring with me, but with all the messiness. And for me, that was this beautiful experience of grace that I hadn't really experienced anywhere else before, even though, as I said, I'd been, I was raised in the church. So these people started, they kept giving back this love and acceptance, and they shared some of their own stories. And so over time, that really created this very strong foundation for me, from which I started working on my own recovery and going on my own journey of sobriety. And for me, that really was a kind of salvation. I would have these moments where I would have reprieve from the addiction that I had struggled with for so long by myself. And the fact that I was able to talk about it in a group with other people who understood me was really beautiful as well. And I ended up, to me, this journey really felt like a kind of salvation. And it wasn't just salvation from addiction, but also salvation from hiding parts of myself. So from hiding, from pretending to be happier and more successful and a whole lot less gay than I am and was at the church, and from pretending to be who I thought that my church and especially God wanted and needed me to be. So in many ways, I talk about finding God in a different place than I was taught to look. I found God not in the church, right, among the saints, but found God in the basement, among the so-called sinners, with the drunks and the junkies. And that was really an interesting experience to me. And over time, I've been going to these places for about 15 years. And over time, I've met so many people who have come into the basement and talk about the fact that they really discovered grace and love there in ways that they hadn't in the church. And for some of them, they have replaced these 12-step meetings with church. So instead of going to church, they now go to these 12-step meetings, and they see it as a kind of church. And in some ways, that's a really beautiful sentiment. And in some ways, as a theologian who is deeply committed to the church, that really concerns me, because I love the church. And so a lot of the research that I do is based on looking at what churches might do to be a more welcoming and open space for people struggling with addiction. Today, though, what I want to focus on, and what Jarell asked me to focus on, is not so much what churches might offer those struggling with addiction, and we do have a lot to offer people, I think, but I want to think about what those who meet in our basements might teach those of us who meet upstairs in the sanctuary. And as a good Reformed theologian and ethicist, I'm going to offer 3 points. The first one is this. I think what we can learn from the basement is that we're all vulnerable and broken. And I think in many ways, a lot of us already know this. One of the sayings that is attributed to 4th century theologian St. Augustine is, the church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints. Maybe you've heard this before, right? The church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints. And I think we mostly buy into this in the church. Most people I've talked to are very much on board with this idea. And, this makes sense because Jesus also talks about this in the Gospels. In Luke, he says, I didn't come to be with the healthy, I came to heal the sick. And so I think in many ways, we're very much on board with this. But one of the things that I've noticed is that for a place that is really on board with being a hospital for sinners, we do seem awfully surprised when any one of us ends up being an actual sinner in our and it's especially true when someone like the pastor ends up being a sinner. I've seen churches fall apart when that happens, which is kind of a strange thing if you think about the fact that we think about ourselves as being a hospital for sinners. I think sometimes when we say we're a hospital for sinners, what we actually mean is that that we're a hospital for sinners sort of out there. But I think part of what Augustine was talking about is that we are the sinners in this scenario. So one of the things I learned in the basement is that we're all broken and vulnerable. And in these basement communities, people are very open about their vulnerability and brokenness. One of the things we do every time we meet, anytime any of us, when we introduce ourselves to each other, I would say, my name is Jen and I'm an addict. And it's not so much a shameful thing to say as just a way of acknowledging that I'm broken and vulnerable. And that's why we exist in this group together, to help each other along the way and to show each other God's love as we deal with these problems. So in the basement, no one is surprised when someone says they're an addict. That's why we exist. No one is even surprised when someone who's been in long-term recovery ends up relapsing. We know that's a possibility for any of us. And we're just glad that they're there talking about it. So one of the things that is important to me from the basement is recognizing that we're all broken and vulnerable. And I would love to see more of that recognition in church. The second thing that I think we can learn from basement communities is that we aren't alone. I came to the basement with an enormous amount of shame. There were things I'd done and said in my addiction that I just didn't want anyone to know about. But over time, I started sharing some of my story with people in those meetings because it was a place where everyone shared their story. And the most interesting thing I discovered about myself is that I'm just not very interesting. I'm actually a pretty average human being. And it turns out that most of what I shared, other people had struggled with. And most of what I shared, they absolutely could relate to. And, I've never heard anything in meetings. I've never heard anyone say anything that I could not in some way relate to. Of course, I haven't experienced everything that every person in those meetings has experienced, but there's always some level, on some feeling level, where I can relate to what was going on with them. And I think, for most of us today in this room, whatever the thing is that you're carrying, whatever the thing is that brings you the most shame, whatever that is, right? Maybe you're struggling with some mental health issue, or maybe, I don't know, you've had an affair. I don't know anyone in this room, so I'm not talking about anyone in particular. Right, whatever it is, my guess is that if you ended up talking about that, you would find that other people have experienced similar things and can absolutely relate to what you're talking about. And I think you would find that you're not as alone as you might think you are. For me, being in these basement communities and being able to share my story in a place where that story was held as sacred, and being in these groups with people who were able to really love me as I was sharing that story and were able to relate to me and shared some of their story with me, that was really a sacred space for me. And it was a space where I started to see God in the faces of the people in the room that I was with. So if the first thing we can learn is that we're all vulnerable and broken, the second thing is that we are not alone. I would say the third thing that we can learn from basement communities is that vulnerability can be an act of hospitality. It's not easy, right, to be a hospital for sinners. I think our impulse a lot of times when we think about wanting to create space for people to be vulnerable and open, I think that most churches are very much on board with this and very much want to be a space where people can share what's going on with them. But I think a lot of the time when we talk about that in churches, or at least when I talk about that, the thing I'm really talking about is I want to create space for you, for someone else to be open and vulnerable. I don't want to be the person sharing. I'm happy to listen to you tell your story. I just don't want to be telling mine. And I think the problem with that is, right, that everyone feels that way. And it's very difficult to begin sharing your story in a place where that just isn't the norm. People don't really like sharing when other people haven't shared first. And so someone has to go first. And so my sense is that vulnerability is an act of hospitality that we can offer each other to create space for other people to share as well. The first time I went to one of these basement communities, I felt an enormous amount of shame. I felt a lot of fear about walking into this new community that I didn't know. And I was very worried that they were going to ask me about myself, that they were going to ask me to share. I was worried that they were going to judge me for being too messed up or not messed up enough. And so I walked in and I was hoping to just to kind of slide in and slide out. But of course, they did notice me because I looked very uncomfortable. And I think all of those people in that room knew that for me, one of the things that I really needed at that moment was to start sharing some of my stories so that I wasn't so alone. But I think they also knew that asking me questions wasn't really going to be the way to get there. And so they did the most beautiful thing for me. 20 people were in that room that day, and every single person there shared with me the story of what brought them to the basement for the first time. So they talked about their brokenness, their pain. They talked about losing access to their kids, about losing spouses, houses, dignity, money. They talked about what was still difficult for them today. And they talked about how these communities for them became places of redemption. And for me, their vulnerability that day was an act of hospitality that allowed me to open up and begin sharing some of what was going on with me. If they hadn't shared first, I would never have started talking to them about what was going on with me. So the question is, right, if we want to be a hospital for sinners, how do we start doing that? How do we start being a place? How do we start using our vulnerability as an act of hospitality? I have a few small ideas, and I'm hoping that you have some as well. One of them is very simple. I imagine that today, unless you're on Zoom, like me, you probably sat next to someone, and that person probably asked you how you were doing. And you probably said something like, fine, or I'm doing well. As I said, right, I'm from the Netherlands, and it took me a few weeks when I arrived here to realize that how are you doing does not mean what I think it means, right? It just means hello. In Holland, we just say hello to each other. But I would be curious what would happen if instead of just saying, I'm doing well or I'm fine, what if you just told the person how you're actually doing? What if you shared with them what's going on with you today or how you're feeling today? One of the things that often happens when I talk on the phone with people struggling with addiction is really one of the first things we share with each other is how we're feeling that day, however that is. Maybe, I'm feeling a little insecure today, or I'm feeling happy or excited or sad or whatever it is. What would it be like if in churches we started sharing with each other how we're doing? And so that's one small thing we can do. Another thing I think that we can do, and I think, once you start sharing how you're doing, I think often you'll find that the person who's on the receiving end of that is both happy to hear you talk about how you're doing and might also feel invited to do the same and might have been longing to do the same and just needed someone else to take that first step. So that's one thing I think we can do. In spaces like this, in Sunday school classes or Bible studies or maybe small groups, you might think about what are some ways that you can be just a little bit more vulnerable than you normally are? What are some things that you might share when we raise prayer requests? What are some things that you might share? So instead of raising the news of the day, what might you raise about yourself that people could pray for? These very small acts of vulnerability, I think, can really change the culture of a place. I've seen this happen in meetings time and time again. Sometimes meetings are, we have these meetings every day, multiple times a day. So sometimes they're a little drab. And sometimes you get these meetings where people end up really not sharing a whole lot of themselves. They end up saying sort of the right things. And then someone in that meeting will take the risk of sharing what's actually going on with them. And all of a sudden, the whole place changes. And as soon as one person takes that risk, I found that everyone else who shares after that person ends up sharing from an open and vulnerable place as well. And all of a sudden, a fairly drab meeting is turned into this beautiful, sacred community where we share our stories with each other and we hold each other. I think these communities, right, where we're able to hold each other's stories as sacred, where we're able to reflect back that people are not alone, I think that's a kind of grace we can offer each other. And it's a way that we can allow people to see who God is on the faces of each other in church. And if the idea of vulnerability as an act of hospitality seems a bit strange and maybe unchurch-like to you, then maybe it's worth remembering, especially right now, that God extended God's hospitality to us by showing up in the form of a tiny, crying, vulnerable baby. Right? God invited us into relationship with God's self by showing up in the most vulnerable form. Our faith, I would argue, is built on the idea that vulnerability is an act of hospitality. It's the way that we invite each other into relationship. And so the question I have for you today is, what might it look like for First Presbyterian in Charlotte to practice vulnerability as an act of hospitality? What might it look like to be a hospital for sinners? And maybe you already are, and maybe I would love to hear how you're doing that. What would it look like to be a place where people can show up fully and completely as themselves, and where they can recognize that they are not alone? So I would actually love to hear from you what that would look like for you. We can do this in one of two ways, and I'm not sure how to read what would be the best way. One way is we could have, I have some questions that we could talk about in smaller groups, or we could talk about it in the larger group. If anyone has very strong feelings, you should voice them now, and we'll do exactly what you say.
Small groups.
Small groups, great. All right, let's do it. So let's break off into groups of about 4 or so. And I would love it if you would spend about 15 minutes, 10 minutes talking about these two questions. So let me see if I can do the technical thing here. So I'm going to share my screen. I thought I was sharing my screen. Oh, here we go. These are the two questions I would love for you to talk about. So if the church is a hospital for sinners, why is it that so many of us feel pressure to show up in our Sunday best, metaphorically speaking? And is that true at First Presbyterian also? And how so? And maybe it's not true. And if it's not, talk about that. And the second question, and this is a question I would love to hear some responses from you from afterwards, is what would it mean for you to practice vulnerability as an act of hospitality? And what could First Presbyterian do to deepen the way it extends this type of hospitality to members and visitors alike? I'd love for you to break into groups of about 4, however you do that, and have a conversation with each other, and then we'll come back, and I would love to hear from some of you. I can't totally tell if you're all back. I think so. It's funny, right? Yeah. Being on Zoom, I have very little power. You can always ignore the TV and just keep talking to each other. I would love to hear from some groups what you came up with. What were some of the things that you heard each other say that that felt important to share in the bigger group?
Will you put the questions back on the screen real quick?
Yep.
Even if you didn't answer the question, it's important to share that, but
Can our group make a comment?
please.
We talked about the fact that Charlotte is a heavy financial services community. And we also had an ex-military person in our group. And it's difficult when you have to go and suit up every day for work or in the military, and you have that persona and you are not to display any vulnerability in a corporate setting, a military setting. So it's very hard to, shed that view and then all of a sudden say, well, now I'm gonna be vulnerable, like home at night or, on Sundays. And we thought it was very challenging. And if anything, the small groups that First Pres has are the places where people can become vulnerable. But in a bigger setting, it's very hard to do because that's not how you're wired. And, that's not your face that you put on every day, when you suit up and no chinks in the armor.
20 years of training.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not gonna tell you anything about me. I will see you in the elevator on Monday.
Yeah, that's very true. And I mean, we all have different jobs and different settings in which we are. I would imagine this is to be especially true in the military. It's true in a lot of other spaces too, right? Where if you work at whatever it is you work at a bank, it's not really the norm to start sharing how you're doing with your colleagues. Sometimes it's possible. I teach, it's not really the norm to be super vulnerable with my students. And often I found too in the basement, I'll meet people and we'll have this vulnerable moment, and then I might see them in another place. And that's a really interesting space. And in some ways, having had that vulnerable moment and then seeing them in the other place, I feel this immediate sense of connection with them that's really beautiful. And I have that even when I meet strangers, let's say on a plane or whatever, and they end up telling me that they go to these meetings. There's this immediate sense of connection. And I wonder what it would be like if the same was true for, if you met someone on a plane and they said they go to church and you felt this immediate sense of, oh, we can talk with each other about what's really going on, because that's what church is.
Yeah.
But I totally understand what you're saying, that it's very difficult to make that shift when that's not how you're meant to be in your quote unquote normal life.
It seems to me that people who are affluent in general, or who are fluent, want to appear that they have it all together and they have the resources to put that facade on. But if you're living in poverty, you don't have all those resources, all the trappings, and so I wonder if it's easier for people living in poverty, or it's just part of the way of life if you're living in poverty. That's a rhetorical question. I don't know, but I think it's something we should observe for ourselves, because we have the capacity to mask.
Yeah, and we have the capacity to completely be self-sufficient, right? If I need something, I'll just pay someone. And I do think if you have fewer means, you simply need to ask for help much more often, and that really changes things. And I think in many ways that's how we were all supposed to be. I don't think we were supposed to end up being these self-sufficient individuals. I actually wanted to go back to this thing about the military too. One of the things I've been thinking about is that, a lot of, I do some work on moral injury, and a lot of veterans, there are, the statistics of people who end up dying by suicide is quite high. So I wonder if even in that space, that actually, being all put together and having no chinks in the armor, if that is actually detrimental to people's health there too. Does anyone else have any things that?
Sorry. I think it is, but detrimental to health. And I've got a direct line to that. My sister-in-law committed suicide, and after that, her parents' health just went downhill and downhill and downhill. I had to take care of them for about 5 years. And so I can relate to what you're talking about, the suicidal thing. And I also have a friend who was a member of the charismatic movement. She lives in Virginia. We've been friends since 4th grade, and we call each other doing word jumbles. And I worry about her because she doesn't want to get her hearing aids fixed, and there's a lot of things that I suggest to her, and so it's hard to, talk to her that far away, 4 hours away from where we live. So,
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think often when people die by suicide, people might, I found that people end up saying things like, oh, if only they'd asked for help, if only they'd said something. And I always think, what would be the occasion on which they would be able to, in the middle of a conversation about the weather, talk about how they're feeling? How would they do that? And so,
no.
I think when you meet in the basement, you sort of know what to expect in a way, don't you? I mean, you know that you're probably going to be asked to share your experiences, and you're going to get experiences of others. Those are very different. You go into the sanctuary, not expecting someone to that you don't know at all suddenly to talk about their vulnerabilities.
But I think what's been said, I think that's where the small groups here in the church could have a real role in this, if they know what the small groups could be, not just a Bible study, but it's a fellowship, and here's some other things we could do for each other.
That's true.
I think you can conceive of the church as a hospital for sinners, but when you show up, you want to be mistaken for one of the doctors instead of one of the patients. That might be the benefit of the addiction, certainly where you do have to acknowledge at the beginning, I'm an addict, and you're acknowledging I'm a patient. So I mean, it might be a question of like, is there a way that we come to the hospital for sinners and say, and we say it in the confession, but that we come to the church and we say like, hey, I'm a patient. I'm here to be healed. I know we're all trying to heal each other.
yeah, wouldn't that be something? Because I think, we believe in redemption. We believe in being right, that we are saved. And yet this journey of life, even after being freed and saved, is so very difficult. And what would it be like if we could talk to each other about how difficult it actually is, even though we know we're already saved? I think about the Israelites in the desert after, so they're freed right from Pharaoh's grip. So you remember the story, I'm sure, right? Moses talks to Pharaoh and let my people go, and eventually after much harangue, right, Pharaoh lets the people go, and the people are freed. And the rest of that story, and it is a long story, the remaining 40 years are about those people learning to shed their identities of bondage and learning to live in freedom. And they do it together, and it's very messy. And there are moments when they say to Moses, we were better off in Egypt because we had food and we had all these things, right? And I think so much of that is true for people struggling with addiction and early recovery. Life in early recovery is actually more difficult than life in addiction was. But I think so much of that is true for all of us as we go on this life's journey, right? That it's difficult to live in freedom. It's difficult to be, the people of Christ. And so what would it be like if we could really walk alongside each other and recognize how difficult this journey is? Is there anything else that any groups talked about that you want to share?
We talked about just the importance of the small group, and we did a lot of reminiscing about the First Neighbor Network, where Gerald took the map of the city and broke us into neighborhoods, and we gathered, outside of the church, and the Christ Care groups, one of which is still going strong. I think that smaller environment where we can really be real with each other and clear honestly and confidentially and have that trust, that's the key, I think.
Our group in the back talked as well about that, about the small groups, and we talked about the trust piece and about safety. It seems to me that's a big part of it. But why? I mean, because Jen, you're sort of raising the question of like not feeling shame. I mean, are we afraid to not share because we feel someone will judge us? So how do you make that? How do you go into one of these groups in a vulnerable way and shed that fear of being judged?
Yeah, I think there's something, so in the basement, one of the ways we do that is we have some commitments together. So one of the things we say at the end is who you see here, what you hear here, when you leave here, don't let it leave here, basically. I'm messing up the saying, but the idea is that right, who you see there in the meetings and what you hear, you just don't share with anyone outside the meetings. So that's one way that happens. But the interesting thing that has happened for me over time is the more that I've shared with people in meetings, the less I feel this fear and this shame, right? The more I'm aware that, oh, we're actually all sharing, we're all dealing with the same things. So even if people outside found out some things about me, that probably wouldn't be the end of the world because they're probably dealing with very similar things. But I think at the beginning, having some way, some commitment around trust, which I think small groups can very much do, right? Having some kind of covenant or commitment around what we share in these groups stays in these groups. And I think small groups are really powerful ways to get, I don't know what it's been like for First Pres, but at my church, it's been very difficult to get people to come back to church after COVID, because I think a lot of people went online or stopped going to church and thought, oh, I don't really miss this. I think in some ways, small groups are a great way to get people to come back, because one of the reasons that I end up going back to the meetings that I go to a lot is because I have friends there and I have people who care about me and who notice when I'm not there. Any last comments?
I might say, in our group, I think the small groups are an important idea. And so I see two opportunities there. One is an actual effort to once again, every few years, we start a new effort, and let's open up some of these groups and give an opportunity for these where vulnerability is the focus, where sharing and personal interaction is the focus. That's one opportunity. The other opportunity is not as deep, but we get together in meetings all the time for different things. And everybody wants the meeting to be businesslike and be over fast. But if there's time for even something as trivial, somebody was saying as an icebreaker, sometimes it's good just to help get people to feel like, oh, I really know this person. They're not this perfect person that is on a pedestal kind of thing.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the more real interaction there is in meetings, the less people will want to get out of there very quickly. Someone in our group also shared the idea of maybe having that fellowship time before church starts, having a little bit more time to talk with each other, and maybe even having, I'm not sure what your situation is there, but having some kind of question up somewhere that could be a starter for people to start talking with each other about something, or that they could even think about during the week. I want to respect your time. I know that you need to go to church. Church is after this, right? Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Let me just close in prayer. God, thank you so much for this time that we had together. And I just pray that you would be with all of us that you would be with me in my church and with the people at First Presbyterian to just start thinking about how it is that we might start being more vulnerable as an act of hospitality in the way that you did for us. Thank you so much for this season and this time. And I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking with you. And yeah, thank you so much.